Next, please welcome to the stage U.S. Congresswoman Sara Jacobs for a conversation with FP's Amelia Lester on rights and representation in 2023.
Okay, Representative, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started because I know you've got to get back for a vote. Yes. Listen, I wanted to start by acknowledging what's happening in the Middle East. It's awful, and the discourse here in the United States and on college campuses is so charged. So I thought I'd just start by seeing where you're at and how you're reflecting on what's going on.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. It's so great to be here with you all. I am the youngest Jewish member of Congress. I have family who lives in Israel. So like many Americans, the conflict in the Middle East is deeply personal to me, like it is, I know, to so many people. And I think that's why we see so much emotion around it. And you know, for me, with family, I still have family there. Some have come to the United States, some are still there. You know, I think it's important to say that Israel has an undeniable right to defend itself, that what we saw Hamas do was inexcusable, disgusting, horrifying, and that we are all strongest when we lead with our values, and that the United States has learned from our last 20 years of wars in the Middle East that you can't fight your way out of this kind of conflict. And so I've been working closely with the Biden administration to make sure that we are getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza, make sure that we are working with Israel on upholding the laws of war, protecting civilian casualties, and I think that's only going to be more important as we go forward.
Well, thank you for that, and our thoughts are with your family there. Let's move to another part of the world. You were elected ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa this year, and I'm told that you've been to the continent half a dozen times this year. There's a lot going on there too. Coups are spreading across the Sahel. There's conflict in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and insecurity, I think it's safe to say, in the region is growing. The US has poured billions of dollars into fighting terrorism in Africa with, I think, little to show for it. So what's a better way forward? What needs to be done differently, do you think?
Yeah, I think this is the key question that we all need to be asking ourselves. We have spent billions of dollars and 20 years, as you said, fighting terrorism in Africa, and we've only seen the threat getting worse. And I think a big part of that is because we've taken a really military first and security first approach to how we address this issue. So if you look at what we've done in East Africa, if you look at what we've done in the Sahel, it's been a lot about empowering their militaries, working with their militaries, going after the bad guys. And what we know is that one of the main drivers of extremism is a lack of civil liberties, is security sector violence against someone you know or yourself. And so sometimes in being so focused on this short-term security approach, military first approach, we end up inadvertently actually feeding the very problem we're trying to solve. Because we are empowering some militaries, and you know, they don't always do everything we want them to do, and sometimes we see human rights abuses, we see civilian casualties, and these things are key drivers of the problem. And so I think that it's important that we reframe the way we're thinking about this issue and focus on a governance first approach to really get at these root problems, to really address what we know are the drivers, and that's something that we can't fight our way out of. And that's why I'm so glad that Congress passed the Global Fragility Act and that we chose coastal West Africa as one of our prevention cases for the Global Fragility Act, which will have a new whole of government approach, a 10-year strategy to make sure that we're actually getting at those underlying drivers of conflict and not just the security and military first approach that we've taken for too long and that frankly hasn't been successful.
That sounds so sensible and almost, dare I say it, intuitive. And it reminds me of the fact that studies have repeatedly shown that feminist groups always settle on nonviolence as their first solution to conflict and to problems. It makes me wonder if you've seen that women do in fact approach problems differently at that level, and if so, why do you think that is?
Look, I'm always going to tell you we need more women at the decision-making table. And I do think we see that it brings important different perspectives. There have been lots of studies that actually show that when you have women, for instance, at a peace negotiating table, the peace negotiated settlement that comes out of that is more durable. It lasts on average 5 years longer when there are women at the table. I also think it's important that we have more young people at the table. Often we see these decisions, whether they're peace negotiations or policy decisions, being made by old white men. That's not necessarily representative of all of the ideas, but it also, we know that young people are the ones who will be living with the consequences of decisions longer than anyone else. We know that women often feel the brunt of conflict in ways different than men do. And so I think it's important that you do have all these different perspectives when you're making decisions.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up age. You are the youngest member of Democratic leadership, I understand, and you mentioned before that you're the youngest Jewish member of Congress. I have to ask, Mazel tov. I have to ask about President Biden's age.
Yeah.
A new AP poll shows that 77% of voters think that Biden is too old to be effective for another 4 years, and that included, I was shocked to read, 69% of Democrats. Mm-hmm. How worried are you about President Biden's age?
So I'll be honest, as someone who is pretty young in Congress, I'm very young, but the average age of Congress is higher than the average age of your average population. I actually am not worried. I see the president rather frequently, and I actually think that when we're in moments like this of great crisis, when we see what's happening in Israel and Gaza, when what was happening in Ukraine, I think that President Biden has done a masterful job at handling these foreign policy issues, in a large part because he's been in the room before and he knows how to avoid the common pitfalls. It's why I think he was able to take the very difficult decision, but in my view, the very correct decision to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan. Because he'd been in the room before when the military said, just give us a little more money, a little more time, we'll be able to get it done. And he knew that with a little more money and a little more time, over and over again, that hadn't been the case. And so I actually think that having a president like Joe Biden in office, who is so experienced in foreign policy that he is able to bring our allies and partners together and is able to exercise the kind of forbearance that is important, is critical right now. And I will say, I can tell you, having had many of these conversations with him, he's also very open to listening to the young people around him. He's constantly soliciting us about, what are we thinking? What should we be pushing back on differently? And I think that combination is exactly what we need right now.
Okay, that's reassuring. I have to ask you about another thing that's keeping people up at night in Washington, which is the Republican quest for a new speaker.
Yeah.
I know that's something you're less involved with. You were just telling me about the new speaker candidate because I've lost track of them. Tell me how Congress can get anything done when there is this level of dysfunction and when, as you pointed out to me backstage, the new speaker candidate did not vote to certify the results of the 2020 election.
Yeah, so the Republicans' current nominee is Mike Johnson. The New York Times called him the key architect of President Trump's efforts to overturn the election. And, it's a real challenge right now because as we see Democratic backsliding all over the world, we're also seeing it at home. And the fact of the matter is, until we have a speaker, we can't do anything on the House floor. And Democrats have time and again said both publicly and privately, we want a bipartisan path forward. We want to work with you. We're really not asking for much. We just want a vote on the funding bills that we already negotiated and agreed on. And time and again, the Republican Party have instead chosen an extreme path and refused to work with us, refused to, as our whip Clark says, refused to take yes for an answer.
Are they more agreeable in person to you, or?
So I will say, I actually work a lot with Republicans on a variety of different issues. Matt Gaetz and I are working together to try and get the U.S. to sign on to the Cluster Bomb Convention, the Convention on Cluster Munitions.
You didn't support the U.S. sending cluster bomb munitions to Ukraine, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So there are things you can work together on, even with the ones who, like, on TV are the craziest. But the fact of the matter is, like, they can't even agree with themselves at the moment. It's not even like we can get to a bipartisan agreement. We don't even know who we're negotiating with. They're not agreeing, like, they can't even agree amongst themselves. I mean, it's really hard to get anything done. And I will say it's not just about, like, what we can do. It impacts our standing around the world, because as we're trying to say that democracies can work, as, you know, as we're meeting, as I'm having meetings with foreign governments, you know, it helps in a way, because we have to have the humility that I think the United States should have had for many years, that we sometimes don't always show, especially with our African partners. But it's also hard to say, we think you should do it this, because they're like, who are you to tell us what to do?
It's certainly distracting. You've got to get out of here for a vote. One last question. Given all of this dysfunction, given the charged rhetoric that we started off with, I have to ask, for young women who look to you as a role model and might want to follow in your footsteps, how do they not get discouraged about this environment, this polarized, charged environment that we're in right now?
Yeah. So I would say that there are definitely times where I feel discouraged, and it is totally normal to feel discouraged. And the only way things are going to get better is if more good people decide to get involved. Because if all the people who are turned off by the chaos and the extremism opt out, then the only people left in the room making decisions are the ones who have chosen that. And so not only does it mean that we should still get involved, it means we need to still get involved. And that is what I try and remind myself on the really hard days, that actually the harder the days are, the more craziness we're seeing, the more important it is that I'm in the room, that we have more people in the room who want to do things differently, and especially young people, because we do have a fundamentally different perspective on issues. Especially when it comes to foreign policy, right? I was in middle school when September 11th happened. I haven't known a single day in my adult life that the United States has not been at war, and that shapes how I think about US engagement in the world. That's very different than how my colleagues from other generations think about US engagement. And so my advice to young women is, please get involved, and don't let anyone tell you that you're too young or you don't know enough to make a difference, because actually, you are what we need more than anything else. We need creativity, we need new ideas, we need your voice now more than ever. So please get involved, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Representative Jacobs, for being here and for being there on the Hill, and best of luck with your trip to the Arctic Circle tomorrow.
Thank you
again.